Deciding what makes an interesting villain is innately a complicated question because different people want different things from villains. Some people want the over the top, histrionic, exaggerated portrayal of evil because they find it fun and enjoyable, and because the defeat of that kind of overblown conception of villainy is quite satisfying. It's innately satisfying. Everyone feels such a burst of relief, I think, when the ring finally melts into the fires of Mount Doom and Sauron is vanquished. Or at the end of The Lion King, when Scar loses his final duel with Simba, the returned prince, and is cast into the flame-consumed Pride Lands where he's torn apart by the hyenas. And I do not want to denigrate that kind of portrayal of villainy. It can be quite effective. However, a lot of other people would want a portrayal of villains that are more human, more understandable. Characters who act in egregious and callous ways, being consumed by passions and egotism and wanton desire, but in these faults are ultimately understandable and their faults are not wholly unbalanced by positive characteristics. These kinds of villains are more interesting from a certain perspective, but not necessarily. They can be done poorly. When you try to make a complicated villain and fail, the result can be worse than if you simply made a over-the-top, overblown, overdramatic portrayal of villainy and did that well. So I'm going to look at the three major villains that we have in The Dragon Prince, not counting all the minor villains of the show, of which there are quite a few, and discuss from what perspective they could be considered good villains, and give my own personal perspective on what I think about these characters. The first and most apparent character that comes to me is Viren. He is the main villain of the show in its first few seasons. He is the one who is constantly pushed into this antagonistic posture. His disdain for the elves and the dragons becomes more exaggerated and more pronounced throughout the show until it sends him into this dependence on Erebos, this enigmatic arcane elf who is the ultimate tempter of the Dragon Prince. Now, there are people who would disagree with me even putting Viren in the quote-unquote villain category and say he is more of an anti-hero. Perhaps there's relevance in that. The boundary between anti-hero and villain is not a solid one and should not be treated as such. Viren is a rather desperate character. He is someone who is motivated by passionate idealism. He believes that the humans have been mistreated. He is deeply resentful at the loss of people he cares about, and he views the approach to try to acquiesce, to try to equivocate with the elves and dragons as being fundamentally useless. This perspective is not wholly egregious or absurd. It emerges from this deep and roiling resentment. It emerges from a sense of genuine powerlessness in comparison to the elves. They have their elemental magic. They have the support of these great, majestic beasts, the dragons. So in that respect, the conflict is clearly tilted toward them. And they have the power to force humans off Zadia entirely, and thus off most of the most fertile land in the world of the Dragon Prince. And yet, they also view dark magic as being fundamentally villainous and unnatural and cruel. It is a perfectly understandable perspective, whether one agrees with it or not, to think that this disdain of dark magic by the elves and the dragons is simply a way to keep the humans powerless, to keep the capacity to control and dominate them, and to convince them that the greatest weapon they have against that control is fundamentally immoral. Viren is resentful at this kind of attitude, and that resentment is amplified by the loss of people he deeply cares about, like Sarai and his best friend Harrow. Viren's greatest flaw is his fanaticism, his myopic insularity. He is committed to a moral view that is understandable, but is also limited. It's not that there is no truth in it, it is that it is so dogmatic and so insular that it is inured from looking to other forms of truth, other perspectives that might offer valuable counterpoints. And so he gives his entire life to Erebos, and that backfires. Ultimately, everything he does, he comes to view it as futile and largely pointless. While understandable, it led to the increased suffering of people he cared about. It led to his own increased suffering, and it led to his daughter being fundamentally warped by Erebos as well. Viren is still a villain. He is antagonistic to the goals of the heroes of the show, and he commits many truly egregious actions. Nonetheless, he is a tragic and sympathetic villain. His arc is complete, and I think he is one of the most compelling and poignant characters in the show. Now, regarding his tempter, Erebos, I am a bit more conflicted. If you want this ultimate cosmic force of evil, that's Erebos. There are all these horrific legends spread about Erebos, about how much discord and suffering he has caused, how he has deluded so many people. He is in the background of the conflicts and the sufferings and the violence that has consumed people in this world. And he is also a character of all these secrets, of all these shadowy truths that we're not quite privileged to hear. And that's fine, but I suppose a problem for me, regarding Erebos, is that there's not a lot of dynamism in his character. I don't mean that he has to change drastically. I simply mean that there's not a lot of variety in what we, the audience, think about him. William James talks about, in his philosophical and psychological work, the incompleteness of any one perspective, of any one frame of reference, of any one source of beliefs about ourselves and the world in which we live in. These beliefs are inevitably, innately going to be outdated. As perfect as they are, even if they were perfectly lucid to how things are now, the world is always constantly changing, and the individual, being innately connected to that world, is always changing too. I'm a different person slightly now than I was before I started recording this video. Tomorrow I will be slightly different again. These changes might be small, but they constantly add up. There's an accretion of them. And so whatever static conceptions of the self, of particular viewpoints, ideologies, belief systems, these viewpoints will inevitably be outdated. They will inevitably be insufficient to comprehend the innate flux and the innate transformation of the world. We get that with Viren, and we get that with Claudia. These are characters who have range. They do change, but even in the minor, everyday ways that people change, not just in the dramatic, grandiose ways in which we normally think of character change. There is a lot of variety in how they act and behave. Viren is capable of great malice, great recklessness, great egotism, but he is also an idealist in a lot of ways. There is a sense that he is observing his environment, observing what is happening, and by moment after moment, slowly changing as a person as a result of that. Claudia is much the same way, and I will talk about her very soon. She is capable of a wide variety of human expression. There are a lot of sides to her that are activated by different emotions, different sensations, different experiences. And there's also the sense that she is malleable, that bit by bit she has to decide how to respond to her environment, and these changes, though not always conscious, result in her becoming a somewhat different person, even from episode to episode. Erebos does not have that. Part of that is because he is this ancient cosmic creature. The constant process of flux is a very human process, and Erebos is not human. Or not even human-ish in the way the elves are. He is something fundamentally different. And he has all these secrets, but ultimately, even if we learn about those secrets, that will just reveal more about who he is now. Who he is does seem pretty constant. He does not seem to have a lot of depth in his interactions. He's the tempter. He's the allurer. He's Mephistopheles and Faust. And that's fine. But I suppose I personally do not find that to be as interesting of a character type as, say, what we see with Claudia. Claudia is not as complete a character as Viren. She is not quite as vividly actualized. Part of that is simply because of the process of the story. Her story is not over yet. Viren's more or less is. There is a completed narrative, a completed arc, as people say, with his character. Claudia's character is still very much being tempered. It's being forged in the fire of unexpected and unpredictable circumstances that she must try to respond to with an admittedly limited and one-sided viewpoint and ideology. She is increasingly succumbing to resentment and ideological vehemence. She is coming to see those who do not take her side as her enemy, as people fundamentally opposed to the goals she considers foremost to the well-being of herself, her father, and her side. She is succumbing, like Viren did, to the temptations of Erebos, because Erebos can offer her what she wants. But at least in Viren's case, what he wanted was understandable. It was in a lot of ways justifiable, even if it was a bit extreme and a bit one-sided and a bit insular. It nonetheless had a basis in a coherent philosophical perspective. Claudia, far more than Viren, is motivated less by a coherent ideology and more by simmering resentment. Part of the shock of Claudia's character, and part of the reason why I do think she is a very good character, is that she is introduced as being very bubbly, very jovial, a bit immature, sure, and a bit too committed to dark magic for her simple enjoyment. But she is a character primarily motivated by enjoyment, by caprice. She loves all the weird and silly parts of life, and that is how she is portrayed, and that's how she is introduced, and to a certain degree, she is still that person. But increasingly, those more playful sides of her are being subsumed within this growing core, harsh, black, somber, of resentment, of this absolutist disdain for anyone who does not believe in the value and wisdom of Erebos, which she believes will help her destroy those who have wronged her. We will see how her journey completes as the show ends. So anyway, tune in soon for next analysis. It will be coming soon, I promise you that. Thank you all again. Keep watching The Dragon Prince. Adios, comrades.